The sound of my shovel scraping against frozen concrete at 11:30 at night had become my meditation, my therapy after impossibly long days at the courthouse. But apparently, it was also grounds for a visit from the homeowners association president herself. I just cleared the last section of my driveway when headlights swung into view, and a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped Patricia Hendricks, clipboard in hand, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore a puffy white coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her face already held that pinched expression I'd seen on countless faces in my courtroom over the years. "Excuse me," she called out, her breath forming clouds in the frigid Colorado air. "Do you realize what time it is?" I leaned on my shovel, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back. Almost midnight. Late snowfall meant I had to wait until I got home from work. That's exactly the problem. She clicked across the icy sidewalk in boots that were clearly more fashion than function. "The neighborhood has noise ordinances. Several residents have complained about your late-night snow removal." I wiped some sweat from my forehead despite the cold. I work long hours. "This is literally the only time I can shovel." Patricia consulted her clipboard like it held the secrets of the universe. "According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws, no outdoor maintenance activities are permitted after 9 p.m. or before 7 a.m. That includes snow removal, lawn mowing, and any other activity that might disturb the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties." "You're kidding." I looked at her, then at my half-finished driveway. "So I'm supposed to just leave it?" "You should arrange for a service to handle it during appropriate hours." She made a note on her clipboard. "This is your first warning. Any additional violations will result in a fine of $250 per occurrence. A warning for shoveling my own driveway." "Rules exist for a reason, mister." She glanced at her papers. "Harrison, Isaac Harrison. We maintain property values in Meadowbrook Estates by ensuring everyone follows the same standards." I knew that name recognition would hit her eventually, but tonight she was too focused on her petty authority to notice. Judge Isaac Harrison. The same judge who'd signed off on every single permit and variance the HOA had requested over the past 5 years. The same judge who presided over the county court where the HOA had filed dozens of cases against residents. But standing here in my old jacket and boots, exhausted from a 14-hour day, I probably didn't look much like the man who sat behind the bench in black robes. "I understand rules," I said carefully, "but this seems unreasonable. I'm not running power equipment. It's a shovel. It barely makes any noise." "Metal scraping on concrete is quite audible, Mr. Harrison. Mrs. Pembroke 3 houses down called me personally. She has a newborn and you woke the baby." That gave me pause. I didn't want to disturb a baby, but I also knew Mrs. Pembroke. She'd lived there for 6 years and all her kids were in elementary school. There was no newborn. Patricia was either lying or hadn't bothered to verify the complaint. "I'll try to be quieter," I offered, knowing it was pointless. "The time restriction stands. 9 p.m. That's final." She turned on her designer heel and picked her way back to her Mercedes, leaving me standing in my driveway with half a job done and a growing sense of frustration. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates 3 years ago after my divorce. The house was modest by neighborhood standards, a 3-bedroom ranch that suited me fine. I'd reviewed the HOA documents before buying, and they'd seemed reasonable enough. Standard stuff about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and keeping the neighborhood tidy. I'd been too busy with work to get involved in HOA politics, paid my dues on time, and generally kept to myself. That had apparently been a mistake. The next morning, I woke to find a formal violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox. It detailed my infraction in bureaucratic language that would have been funny if it wasn't so petty. The notice informed me that photographic evidence of my violation had been documented, and that any future infractions would result in immediate fines and possible legal action. I stood there in my bathrobe and slippers, holding this ridiculous notice, and felt something shift inside me. I'd spent 15 years on the bench watching petty tyrants abuse whatever small power they'd been given. I'd seen HOAs run roughshod over reasonable homeowners, using their positions to bully and intimidate. Usually, I maintained strict neutrality. The law was the law, and HOA covenants were legally binding contracts. But there was a difference between enforcing reasonable rules and wielding authority like a weapon. At the courthouse that morning, I had a light docket, 2 preliminary hearings and 1 motion to dismiss. I wrapped up by noon and asked my clerk, Jennifer, to pull some files for me. "I need everything we have on Meadowbrook Estates HOA," I said. "Every case, every permit request, every variance application for the last 7 years. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. She'd worked for me long enough to know I didn't make random requests. Everything. And I need property records too. Who sits on the board, how long they've been there, what their roles are." She nodded and disappeared into the maze of filing systems. By 3 that afternoon, my desk was covered with folders and documents. I sent Jennifer home and locked my office door, then started reading. What I found was illuminating. Meadowbrook Estates HOA had filed 47 cases in county court over the past 7 years. 47. That was an extraordinary number for a neighborhood of only 200 homes. Most HOAs filed maybe 1 or 2 cases a year, usually for serious violations or unpaid dues. But Meadowbrook had been filing cases for everything imaginable. Grass too long, wrong shade of mailbox, unapproved holiday decorations. One case involved a resident who'd planted roses in their front yard without submitting the proper landscaping modification form. The success rate was impressive too. 41 wins, 6 settlements, no losses. The HOA had collected over $200,000 in fines, court costs, and legal fees over that period. Then I looked at the permit requests. In the past 18 months alone, the HOA had requested variances for a new community center, expansion of the pool facilities, installation of security cameras at all entrances, and modification of common area lighting. Every single request had required court approval because they involved easements or modifications to the original development plan. I'd signed off on all of them. The requests had seemed reasonable, properly documented, and within the scope of HOA authority. But now, looking at them alongside the litigation pattern, I saw something else. The HOA was operating like a small corporation, aggressively enforcing rules to generate revenue while expanding amenities that primarily benefited board members and their immediate neighbors. The community center was being built adjacent to Patricia Hendricks' property. The pool expansion added cabanas, and guess who'd been photographed in the HOA newsletter using them? Board members. The security cameras captured license plates and visitor information, which had been used as evidence in violation cases. It was all legal, technically, but it stank of self-dealing and abuse of power. I went home that evening with a lot on my mind. It had started snowing again, light flurries that wouldn't amount to much. I changed into jeans and a sweatshirt, made myself dinner, and tried to watch television. But my mind kept circling back to that violation notice and the pattern I'd uncovered. Around 10 p.m., I heard a vehicle outside. I looked out the window and saw a white pickup truck with Meadowbrook Estates, HOA emblazoned on the side, driving slowly down the street. A spotlight mounted on the roof swept across front yards and driveways. I watched as it stopped 3 houses down, and someone got out to take photos of a trash can that had been left at the curb. This was enforcement. Active, aggressive, late-night enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA could drive around with spotlights at 10 p.m., but I couldn't quietly shovel my driveway at 11. The next evening brought more snow. Not a blizzard, but enough to require clearing. I got home at 8, ate quickly, and went out at 8:45. If I started before 9, technically I wasn't violating their rule. I'd just have to work fast. I'd cleared maybe 10 feet when the Mercedes appeared again. Patricia stepped out, this time accompanied by a man I recognized from the HOA documents. Brett Calloway, vice president and head of the Architectural Review Committee. He was tall, probably mid-50s, with the kind of artificial tan that spoke of regular trips somewhere warm. "Mr. Harrison," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm glad we caught you. This is Brett Calloway. He's here to witness your compliance with our previous warning." "I'm shoveling before 9 p.m., I said, checking my watch. 8:53. Brett pulled out his phone and took a photo of me. "We're documenting the start time. If you're still out here after 9, that's a violation." I stared at him. "You're seriously going to sit here and watch me shovel?" "We take our responsibilities seriously," Patricia said. "The health and harmony of our community depends on everyone following the rules." They got back in the Mercedes but didn't leave. They parked right there at the curb, engine running, watching me work. I felt like a prisoner under guard, which I suppose was exactly the feeling they wanted to create. I shoveled as fast as I could, but driveways don't care about HOA deadlines. At 8:59, I'd cleared maybe 2/3 of the space. The Mercedes headlights flashed. Patricia rolled down her window. "1 minute, Mr. Harrison." I kept shoveling. I had 30 feet left. "Time's up," Brett called out at precisely 9 p.m. "That's a violation. I'm almost done." "Doesn't matter. Rules are rules." Patricia was typing something on her phone. "You'll receive your fine notice in the mail. $250, something snapped. Maybe it was the long day. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation. Or maybe it was 15 years of watching bullies hide behind bureaucracy. I walked over to the Mercedes, still holding my shovel. "You know what I do for a living, Patricia?" She looked at me with barely concealed contempt. "I neither know nor care. What you do on your own time is your business, but when you're in Meadowbrook Estates, you follow our rules." "I'm a judge," I said quietly. "County court. I'm the judge who signs off on every permit request, every variance, every easement modification your HOA submits." The change in her expression was subtle but satisfying. Brett's artificial tan seemed to pale a shade. "That doesn't change anything," Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "The rules apply to everyone equally." "They do," I agreed. "Which is interesting, because I've been reviewing your enforcement patterns. Seems like the HOA is very aggressive about some rules and very lenient about others. Want to guess which residents get the most attention? Are you threatening us?" Brett leaned forward. "Because that sounds like judicial misconduct. Not threatening. Observing. As a resident, I have the same rights as everyone else to question HOA practices. As a judge, I have a responsibility to ensure that parties appearing before me are acting in good faith. Those are separate roles, but they both matter." I went back to shoveling. My driveway, my rules until the clock said otherwise. They sat there for another few minutes, then drove off. I knew I'd made an enemy, but honestly, Patricia had already decided I was one the moment I inconvenienced her with my working class schedule. The fine notice arrived 3 days later, certified mail. $250 for violation of noise ordinances. It included instructions for payment and a warning that failure to pay within 30 days would result in additional penalties and possible legal action. I didn't pay it. Instead, I filed a dispute through the proper channels, requesting a hearing before the HOA board. Colorado law required HOAs to provide due process for fines over $100. I knew the hearing would be a formality, that the board would rubber stamp Patricia's decision, but I wanted everything documented. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which gave me time to do more research. I started attending HOA board meetings, something I'd never bothered with before. They were held monthly in the community center, that expensive building I'd approved that sat mostly empty except for these meetings and the occasional resident event. The first meeting I attended had maybe 15 people in the audience, most of them there to contest various violations. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room, Patricia in the center, Brett to her right, and 3 other members I'd seen in the documents. Linda Morrison, treasurer, Craig Stillwell, secretary, and Deanne Murphy, member at large. I sat in the back and watched as they processed the agenda. Every decision was predetermined. Residents would present their cases, explaining why they'd violated some obscure rule, and the board would nod sympathetically before denying every appeal. A woman had planted vegetables in her backyard without approval. Denied. A man had installed a basketball hoop for his kids. Denied. Remove it or face daily fines. A couple had painted their front door navy blue instead of the approved colonial blue from the official color palette. Denied. Repaint immediately. The whole process took 90 minutes, and not once did the board side with a resident. When they called for new business, I stood up. I'd like to address the board about enforcement procedures. Patricia's eyes found me in the back. This isn't the appropriate time for general comments. If you have a specific violation to discuss, that should be scheduled through proper channels. I have a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks about my violation, but my question is about policy, which affects all residents. What criteria does the HOA use to determine which violations warrant late-night enforcement patrols? We respond to complaints from residents, Patricia said smoothly. So enforcement is complaint-driven, not systematic. We also conduct regular patrols to ensure compliance. At what times? Brett shifted in his seat. Mr. Harrison, if you're upset about your fine, you can address that at your hearing. I'm asking about policy. The bylaws specify quiet hours after 9 p.m., but the HOA conducts enforcement patrols with spotlights well after that time. How is that consistent? Linda Morrison, the treasurer, spoke up. She was a nervous-looking woman in her 60s. The patrols are necessary to catch violations that occur after dark. Like snow shoveling. Like any violation, Patricia cut in. Mr. Harrison, you're wasting the board's time. If you have specific concerns, document them and submit them through proper channels. This meeting is adjourned. She gavelled before I could respond, and the board filed out through a side door. Several residents approached me afterward, asking if I was really going to fight the HOA. One man, probably in his 70s, shook his head. Not worth it, son. They'll just fine you into bankruptcy. That's what they do. They make the rules impossible to follow, then collect fines when you break them. It's a racket, but it's legal. Maybe. But legal and ethical weren't always the same thing. My hearing arrived on a Tuesday evening. I'd prepared carefully, printing out relevant documents and photographs. I'd also done something else. I'd requested the HOA's financial records. Colorado law required HOAs to make financial statements available to residents within 10 business days of a request. I'd submitted mine 3 weeks ago, giving them plenty of time. They hadn't provided them. The hearing was held in a small conference room in the community center. The full board was present, along with the HOA's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Fields. She worked for a firm that specialized in HOA representation, and I'd seen her in my courtroom dozens of times. She recognized me immediately. "Your Honor," she said, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. Habit." "No problem, Miss Fields." I sat down across from the board. "I appreciate you all taking the time for this hearing." Patricia shuffled papers. "Let's keep this brief. You violated a clear rule about noise during quiet hours. The fine is appropriate and will stand unless you can provide compelling evidence otherwise." "I'd like to start by questioning the enforcement pattern," I said. "The rule prohibits outdoor maintenance activities after 9 p.m. But the HOA conducts regular patrols, often with loud vehicles and spotlights, well after that time. How is that consistent?" "HOA operations are exempt from resident restrictions," Brett said. "That's standard in every HOA. Is it in the bylaws?" Silence. Margaret Fields flipped through a binder. "The bylaws grant the board authority to conduct necessary operations, which would include enforcement activities. But there's no specific exemption from the quiet hours rule." "The exemption is implied by the operational authority," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I'd also like to address the complaint that triggered this enforcement action. Patricia told me a neighbor called about noise disturbing a newborn. I've checked property records and spoken with neighbors. There's no newborn within 6 houses of my property. The complaint appears to be fabricated." Patricia's face flushed. "We don't reveal the identity of complainants to protect their privacy." "But you used a specific detail, the newborn, to justify the enforcement. If that detail was false, it suggests the complaint itself may be questionable." "Are you calling me a liar?" Patricia's voice rose. "I'm questioning the basis for the enforcement action. Additionally, I requested the HOA's financial records 3 weeks ago. Colorado law requires you to provide them within 10 business days. I haven't received them." "Why not?" Margaret Fields cleared her throat. "Mr. Harrison, this hearing is about your specific violation, not about HOA financial matters. It's relevant. If the HOA is selectively enforcing rules to generate fine revenue, that affects the legitimacy of this fine. I have evidence that Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, has filed 47 legal cases in 7 years, collecting over $200,000 in fines and fees. That's an exceptionally high rate compared to similar communities. It suggests enforcement is financially motivated rather than genuinely focused on community welfare." "That's a serious accusation," Craig Stillwell, the secretary, said. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd been silent until now. "We enforce rules to protect property values." "Then explain why variance requests that benefit board members are approved, while resident requests for minor modifications are systematically denied. Explain why the new community center is located adjacent to Patricia's property, increasing her property value. Explain why the pool cabanas are used primarily by board members and their families." "This hearing is over." Patricia stood up. "Your fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or we'll file a lien against your property." "I'm not done presenting my case." "Yes, you are. We've heard enough." Margaret Fields put a hand on Patricia's arm, trying to calm her, but Patricia shook it off. "You think being a judge makes you special. You're just another resident here and you'll follow the rules like everyone else." Actually, Being a judge means I understand the law. Colorado HOA law requires you to conduct hearings fairly and consider all evidence. You're required to provide financial records when requested. You're required to enforce rules consistently and in good faith. You've violated all of those requirements. Get out, Patricia said. I gathered my papers. I'll see you in court. The next morning, I filed a lawsuit against Meadowbrook Estates HOA in county court, not in my own courtroom, obviously. That would be a conflict of interest. I filed it in Judge Rachel Morrison's court, a colleague I respected who had no connection to HOA cases. The suit alleged selective enforcement, failure to provide required financial disclosures, and violation of due process requirements. I also filed a separate motion to stay the fine pending resolution of the lawsuit. Margaret Fields filed a response within a week, denying all allegations and moving to dismiss for failure to state a claim. She argued that HOAs had broad discretion in enforcement matters and that I hadn't exhausted all administrative remedies. Judge Morrison scheduled a preliminary hearing for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, life in Meadowbrook Estates got interesting. The HOA filed a lien against my property for the unpaid fine, plus late fees. That was aggressive but expected. What I didn't expect was the systematic harassment that followed. It started small. I received a violation notice for my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Then another for a small oil stain on my driveway. Then one for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. Every single notice came with a $250 fine. I documented everything. Photographs, timestamps, copies of every notice. I also started documenting other properties in the neighborhood. Turns out, dozens of homes had similar violations that weren't being enforced. Wrong mailbox colors, visible trash cans, oil stains, minor landscaping issues. But only certain residents were getting notices, and I was at the top of the list. The white pickup truck with the spotlight became a regular fixture on my street. Some nights it would drive past my house 3 or 4 times, always slowing down, always shining that spotlight across my property looking for violations. Other residents started reaching out to me, quietly at first, afraid of retaliation. A woman named Susan told me she'd been fighting the HOA for 2 years over a fence they claimed was 6 inches too tall. She'd spent $15,000 on legal fees and still hadn't won. A retired veteran named Tom had been fined for displaying an American flag that was supposedly too large, despite federal law protecting flag displays. I started collecting these stories, these examples of HOA overreach. Each one added to the picture of an organization that had lost its way, that had transformed from a community organization into something closer to a protection racket. The preliminary hearing finally arrived. Judge Morrison's courtroom was smaller than mine, more modern. Margaret Fields represented the HOA, and Patricia sat in the gallery with Brett, both of them radiating hostility. Judge Morrison was in her early 50s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd reviewed the filings carefully, and I could tell from her questions that she understood the issues. "Miss Fields," she began, "your motion to dismiss argues that HOAs have broad discretion in enforcement. But Mr. Harrison has presented evidence of selective enforcement and potential financial self-dealing. Those are serious allegations. Your Honor, HOA boards are made up of volunteers trying to maintain community standards. Enforcement decisions necessarily involve discretion. Some violations are more visible or problematic than others. But the pattern here suggests enforcement is being used punitively against specific residents, particularly those who question board authority. That's not legitimate discretion. Mr. Harrison is a sophisticated party who knew the HOA rules when he purchased his property. He signed the covenants. Being sophisticated doesn't waive his rights to fair treatment, Judge Morrison said. She turned to me. Mr. Harrison, what remedy are you seeking? An injunction preventing enforcement of fines until the HOA demonstrates consistent, good faith enforcement practices. An order requiring the HOA to provide complete financial disclosure to all residents, and a review of the HOA's governance practices to ensure compliance with Colorado law. That's extraordinarily broad, Margaret Fields objected. Courts rarely interfere with HOA internal governance. Courts intervene when HOAs violate the law, I said. And I have evidence of multiple violations, financial records that should be public but aren't being disclosed, enforcement patterns that constitute harassment, variance approvals that benefit board members personally. Judge Morrison tapped her pen on the bench. I'm going to allow this case to proceed. Miss Fields, your motion to dismiss is denied. I want full financial disclosure within 14 days. I also want a complete list of all violations cited in the past 3 years, including the residents cited, the nature of the violation, and the resolution. Discovery will proceed on an expedited basis, with a trial date set for 3 months from now. Patricia stood up in the gallery. This is outrageous. He's using his position to, Madam, sit down, Judge Morrison said sharply. You're not a party to this proceeding and you will not interrupt my courtroom. I'm the HOA president. Then you should know better. Sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. Patricia sat, her face purple with rage. The hearing wrapped up with scheduling orders and discovery deadlines. As we filed out, Margaret Fields pulled me aside. Isaac, what are you really after here? You know HOAs usually win these cases. I want them to follow the law. That's it. Fair enforcement, financial transparency, basic good governance. Patricia is never going to back down. She's made this personal. She made it personal when she decided to harass me for shoveling my driveway. I just want to live in peace. Margaret sighed. I'll talk to the board. Maybe we can settle this. I'm open to settlement. If they agree to consistent enforcement policies, stop the harassment and provide proper financial disclosure, I'll drop the suit and pay the original fine. I'll present it to them. She did. They rejected it within 24 hours. Discovery was revealing. The HOA was forced to produce 3 years of financial records, meeting minutes, and enforcement logs. I spent hours going through it all, and what I found was damning. The HOA had collected over $300,000 in fines over 3 years. But only 70 residents had been cited, out of 200 total homes. Those 70 residents had received an average of 12 violations each, while the other 130 homes had received 0 citations. When I cross-referenced the violation lists with property records, a clear pattern emerged. The residents being cited were disproportionately lower income, older, or non-white. The residents not being cited included all 5 board members, their immediate neighbors, and a cluster of homeowners in the newer, more expensive section of the neighborhood. It was textbook disparate impact discrimination. The variance approvals were equally problematic. The board had approved every request that came from board members or their families, including several that clearly violated the architectural guidelines. But resident requests were denied at a 90% rate. Most damning were the meeting minutes. I found several entries where board members discussed problem residents and strategies for encouraging them to relocate. One set of minutes from 18 months ago included a discussion about increasing enforcement against less desirable properties, to maintain neighborhood character. I shared all of this with Judge Morrison in a supplemental brief. I also did something else. I sent copies to the Colorado Attorney General's office and to a reporter I knew at the Denver Post who covered HOA issues. The AG's office sent an investigator within a week. The reporter published a story 3 days later with the headline, Meadowbrook Estates, HOA accused of discriminatory enforcement practices. That's when things escalated. The HOA held an emergency meeting and voted to increase my fines for ongoing violations. They claimed I'd failed to remedy the issues they'd cited, even though I'd corrected every single one. My mailbox was now the approved shade of black. The oil stain was gone. My trash cans were stored out of sight, but they sent me notices anyway, claiming the corrections were inadequate. The total fines now exceeded $10,000. They also sent notices to the residents who'd spoken with me, the ones who'd shared their stories. Susan, the woman with the fence issue, received 5 new violations in 1 week. Tom, the veteran with the flag, got cited for having weeds in his lawn even though his grass was immaculate. It was retaliation, pure and simple. I filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, arguing that the HOA was engaging in witness intimidation and harassment. Judge Morrison held a hearing within 48 hours. This time, Patricia and the entire board showed up along with Margaret Fields. The courtroom was also packed with residents, more than I'd expected. Word had spread about the lawsuit, and people were paying attention. Judge Morrison didn't waste time. Miss Fields, Mr. Harrison has presented evidence that your client has issued multiple violation notices against him and other residents within days of this lawsuit proceeding. The timing is suspicious. The violations are legitimate, Your Honor. The HOA has a responsibility to enforce its rules. Even when those rules weren't being enforced before, even when the alleged violations appear to be pretextual, we've stepped up enforcement across the entire neighborhood. Have you? Judge Morrison pulled out a document. According to Mr. Harrison's investigation, violation notices have increased 400% against a specific subset of residents, those involved in this lawsuit or who have spoken with Mr. Harrison. Meanwhile, enforcement against other residents has remained static. That's not consistent enforcement. That's retaliation. Patricia couldn't help herself. She stood up again. Your Honor, this man is abusing his position as a judge to intimidate our board. He's been harassing us, threatening us, trying to destroy our HOA because he doesn't want to follow simple rules. Mrs. Hendricks, I will not warn you again. Sit down and be quiet. He's corrupt. He's been signing off on our permits while secretly planning to attack us. That's a conflict of interest. Judge Morrison's expression went from annoyed to furious. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Hendricks from the courtroom. She's in contempt. Patricia's mouth fell open. You can't do this. I just did. $1,000 or 24 hours in custody. Your choice. The bailiff, a large man with infinite patience, gently took Patricia's arm. She jerked away from him, which was a mistake. Resisting a court officer was a separate charge. Brett jumped up to intervene, which made things worse. Within seconds, the situation had devolved into chaos. Judge Morrison gavelled repeatedly. Order! Everyone sit down right now. Eventually, things calmed. Patricia was removed from the courtroom, still protesting. Brett sat down, pale and shaking. The rest of the board looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Let's be very clear, Judge Morrison said. This court will not tolerate intimidation, retaliation, or harassment. I'm granting Mr. Harrison's motion for a temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from issuing any new violation notices against Mr. Harrison or any resident who has cooperated with his investigation pending resolution of this case. Any violation of this order will result in additional contempt charges. Is that understood? Margaret Fields nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to stay all pending fines against Mr. Harrison and to cease all collection activities. Miss Fields, I suggest you have a serious conversation with your clients about settlement. This case is not going well for them. The hearing ended, and I walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of reporters. The story had gotten bigger than I'd anticipated. HOA abuse was a hot topic, and the fact that a judge was taking on his own HOA made it irresistible to the media. I gave a brief statement, careful not to say anything that would prejudice the case. But the message was clear. HOAs needed to be held accountable when they abused their power. That evening, my phone rang. It was Margaret Fields. Isaac, we need to talk about settlement. The board is panicking. I imagine they are. Patricia's little outburst didn't help their case. She's been removed as president. The board voted her out this afternoon. Brett's taking over and he wants to settle. Same terms as before. Consistent enforcement policies, financial transparency, and they drop all fines against me and the other residents they've been targeting. They'll agree to that, but they want something from you. What? They want you to resign from any oversight of their permit requests. They're claiming bias. I thought about it. I'll recuse myself from any future Meadowbrook HOA matters, but I'm not admitting any wrongdoing. My approval of their permits was based on the evidence they presented. If that evidence was misleading, that's on them. Fair enough. I'll draw up the settlement agreement. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. The HOA agreed to comprehensive reforms. Independent oversight of enforcement decisions, quarterly financial reports to all residents, clear criteria for variance approvals, and a prohibition on enforcement activities after 9 p.m. They also agreed to refund all fines collected from me and the other residents who'd been targeted. Patricia resigned from the board entirely after paying her contempt fine. Brett took over as president and actually seemed interested in running the HOA fairly. Linda Morrison, the treasurer, finally released complete financial records showing where all that fine money had gone. Much of it had been spent on legal fees and administrative costs that primarily benefited Patricia and her allies. The Attorney General's investigation continued separately, looking into potential fraud and self-dealing charges. I stayed out of that process, but I provided them with copies of everything I'd discovered. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal. I could shovel my driveway whenever I needed to without fear of harassment. The white pickup truck with the spotlight disappeared. Residents who'd been living in fear of the HOA started to relax. 6 months after the settlement, I was in my chambers when Jennifer buzzed me. "Judge Harrison, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about Meadowbrook Estates." I wasn't handling HOA matters anymore, so this was irregular. "Who is it?" Linda Morrison, the former treasurer. I had her shown in. Linda looked nervous, clutching a large envelope. "Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry to bother you, but I found something I think you should see." She opened the envelope and pulled out bank records and canceled checks. After the settlement, I started going through old financial records more carefully. Patricia had been handling a lot of the bookkeeping herself, which wasn't proper. I found these accounts she'd set up without board approval. I examined the documents. There were 3 separate accounts, all in the HOA's name but with only Patricia as a signatory. Over the past 5 years, she'd transferred nearly $100,000 from the main HOA account into these private accounts. The money had been disguised as payments for services, legal fees, and maintenance costs. But the vendors listed were shell companies, and the money had ultimately flowed to accounts controlled by Patricia. "This is embezzlement," I said. "I know. I've already contacted the Attorney General's office, but I wanted you to know too, you started all this. If you hadn't fought back, this never would have come out." I made copies of everything and sent Linda back to the AG's office. Then I sat in my chambers, thinking about how many HOAs might be operating the same way. How many petty tyrants were using their positions to enrich themselves while intimidating residents into silence. Patricia was arrested 3 weeks later and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of a fiduciary position. The case was assigned to Judge Morrison, who handled it efficiently. Patricia pleaded guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to make full restitution to the HOA. Brett, the new president, worked with the board to implement real reforms. They hired a professional management company to handle daily operations, created an independent review board for enforcement decisions, and established term limits for board members. Meadowbrook Estates became, if not perfect, at least functional and fair. As for me, I learned an important lesson about standing up to bullies, even when they hide behind bureaucracy and rules. I also gained a new appreciation for how the law can be twisted to serve the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. One evening about a year after everything started, I was shoveling my driveway again after a late-season snowstorm. It was 10:30 at night, well past the old quiet hours, though those restrictions had been modified in the settlement. A car pulled up and I tensed reflexively before recognizing Tom, the veteran with the flag issue. He rolled down his window. "Need some help?" "I'm good, thanks. You know, before you fought the HOA, I was thinking about selling. Couldn't take the harassment anymore, but you changed things. Made this place livable again. I just wanted to shovel my driveway in peace," I said. "You did more than that. You reminded everyone that rules are supposed to serve people, not the other way around." He drove off, and I finished my shoveling. The night was quiet except for the scrape of metal on concrete, a sound that no longer carried the weight of threat or violation. Just the sound of a man taking care of his property, in his own time, in his own way. The snow fell softly, covering everything in fresh white, erasing the tracks and marks of the day. Tomorrow there would be more work, more challenges, more cases in my courtroom. But tonight my driveway was clear, and that was enough. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondered if she understood how she'd let power corrupt her, how she'd transformed a simple community organization into an instrument of oppression. Probably not. People like that rarely saw themselves as villains. They believed in the rules they enforced, even when those rules served only themselves. The real victory wasn't the settlement or the criminal conviction. It was the precedent. Other HOAs in the county had taken notice. Board members were more careful now, more aware that they could be held accountable. Residents were less afraid to question unfair enforcement. The balance of power had shifted just a little toward fairness. I put my shovel away and went inside, tracking snow across the kitchen floor. My house was small and modest, nothing special by Meadowbrook standards. But it was mine, and I could maintain it on my own schedule without fear. That was worth fighting for. The next week, I was in my courtroom when a new case came across my desk. Another HOA dispute, this time from a different neighborhood. A resident was being fined for having a vegetable garden in their front yard. The HOA claimed it violated aesthetic standards. I recused myself, as I'd promised. This was Judge Morrison's territory now. But I sent her a note with the file. Look closely at the enforcement pattern. One garden violation might be a rule, a dozen might be a civil rights issue. She sent back a smiley face emoji, which was hilariously unprofessional and exactly what I needed to see. The system was working. People were paying attention. The small tyrants were being checked. That evening there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Brett holding a bottle of wine. "Peace offering," he said. "I know we didn't start on good terms." I invited him in. We sat in my living room, and he told me about the challenges of reforming the HOA, dealing with old guard members who resented the changes, trying to balance enforcement with fairness. "Patricia made it look easy," he said. "Just enforce everything against everyone, but that's not sustainable. People need grace. Life is complicated." "Exactly," I said. "Rules are necessary, but they're tools, not weapons." I wish I'd understood that earlier. I went along with Patricia because it was easier than fighting. I'm ashamed of that now. You're fixing it, that matters. We talked for a couple hours about HOA governance, about community building, about how power corrupts even in the smallest organizations. Brett left around 10, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Meadowbrook Estates wasn't perfect. The new board made mistakes. Some residents still complained about enforcement being too lax or too strict. But it was better. Measurably, obviously better. People weren't afraid. That was progress. Winter turned to spring, and I started working on a legal article about HOA reform. I reached out to attorneys who specialized in HOA law, to civil rights organizations, to residents who'd fought similar battles. The response was overwhelming. Everyone had stories of HOA abuse, of petty tyrants wielding covenants like weapons, of ordinary people bankrupted by fine after fine after fine. I compiled it all into a comprehensive proposal for legislative reform. Colorado law was already better than most states, but there were gaps. HOAs needed stronger oversight, clearer limitations on their authority, better protection for residents who challenged unfair practices. I presented my proposal to a state legislator who'd been looking for HOA reform ideas. She loved it and promised to introduce a bill in the next session. Whether it would pass was another question, but at least the conversation was happening. One Saturday morning, I was mowing my lawn when Susan, the woman with the fence issue, walked over with her husband. They'd brought a gift basket full of homemade cookies and bread. "We wanted to thank you," Susan said. "We just settled our fence case. The HOA agreed to drop everything and reimbursed us for our legal fees. That's wonderful. It never would have happened without you. You proved they could be beaten." Her husband shook my hand. "You could have just paid the fine and moved on." "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. Because it wasn't about the fine. It was about the principle. If we let HOAs act like little dictatorships, where does it end? Someone has to push back. "Well, thank you for being that someone." They left, and I finished my lawn. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the Attorney General's office. The investigator, a methodical woman named Carol, had been digging into HOA practices statewide. "Judge Harrison, I wanted you to know we've opened investigations into 6 other HOAs showing similar patterns to Meadowbrook. Your case broke this wide open. We found embezzlement, kickback schemes, all sorts of corruption." How widespread is it? Hard to say. There are over 10,000 HOAs in Colorado. We're only scratching the surface. But your lawsuit created precedent. Residents have leverage now. That's good to hear. One more thing. We're organizing a task force on HOA reform. Would you be willing to serve as an advisor? Absolutely. I spent the next year splitting time between my judicial duties and the HOA Reform Task Force. We interviewed hundreds of residents, reviewed thousands of cases, and drafted comprehensive recommendations for legislative and regulatory changes. The work was tedious but important. Every story we heard reinforced why this mattered. An elderly woman forced to sell her home because she couldn't afford HOA fines for her lawn browning during a drought. A disabled veteran cited for having a wheelchair ramp that violated architectural standards. A family fined thousands of dollars for their children drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. The abuse was systemic and widespread, enabled by laws that gave HOAs enormous power with minimal oversight. We worked to change that. The legislative session brought mixed results. Our comprehensive reform bill was watered down through compromise, but ultimately passed. It required HOAs to provide clearer notice of violations, created an expedited dispute resolution process, and mandated independent financial audits. Not everything we wanted, but a step forward. Back in Meadowbrook Estates, life continued. The HOA's new management company brought professional standards and consistency. Enforcement still happened, but fairly. Residents could challenge decisions without fear of retaliation. The neighborhood felt like a community again rather than a fiefdom. I was sitting on my porch one evening when a moving truck pulled up across the street. A young couple with 2 small kids was moving in. I walked over to introduce myself and welcome them to the neighborhood. "Is the HOA pretty strict here?" the husband asked. "We've heard horror stories about HOAs." "It used to be," I said, "but it's better now. Fair enforcement, reasonable rules. If you have issues, there's a process. Just don't be afraid to speak up if something seems wrong." "That's good to know." I helped them unload boxes for a while, feeling the simple satisfaction of community connection. This was what HOAs were supposed to foster. Not fear or control, but neighbors helping neighbors. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd been keeping throughout this experience. Looking back at everything that had happened, from that first violation notice to the criminal conviction to the legislative reforms, I was struck by how one small act of resistance had cascaded into real change. It started with shoveling my driveway at night because that's when I had time. It could have ended with me paying a fine and accepting injustice. Instead, it became a fight for principle, for fairness, for the idea that rules should serve communities rather than control them. The last entry in my journal read, "Institutions derive their legitimacy from serving the people they govern." When they forget that, when they become tools of oppression rather than organization, resistance becomes necessary. I didn't set out to reform HOAs or challenge Patricia's corruption. I just wanted to maintain my property on my own schedule. But sometimes the fight chooses you, and you have to decide whether to accept injustice or push back. I'm glad I pushed back. Meadowbrook Estates is better for it, and maybe some other neighborhoods will be too. 2 years after the settlement, I received a letter from the Colorado Bar Association. They were giving me an award for public service, recognizing my work on HOA reform. The ceremony was downtown at a fancy hotel. Jennifer insisted on coming. "You never celebrate anything, Judge. You're going to this." The ceremony was pleasant if a bit self-congratulatory. Lots of lawyers giving speeches about justice and service. When my turn came, I kept it brief. HOAs are meant to maintain communities and protect property values. Those are legitimate goals. But power corrupts. Even small power, and HOAs wield considerable authority over people's homes and lives. We need to ensure that power is exercised fairly, transparently, and with accountability. That's not just good governance. It's basic justice. Thank you." The audience applauded. Afterward, several people approached me with their own HOA horror stories. I listened, offered advice when I could, and connected them with resources. The fight was ongoing, but we'd built infrastructure to support it. On the drive home, I detoured through Meadowbrook Estates. The neighborhood looked good. Well-maintained but not obsessively perfect. Holiday decorations that showed personality rather than conformity. Kids playing in yards without parents nervously watching for HOA patrols. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at my modest house. It needed painting soon. The gutters probably needed cleaning. Normal homeowner stuff, manageable without fear of fines or harassment. Inside, I changed out of my suit and made dinner. As I ate, I thought about Patricia, now probably finishing her prison sentence. I didn't feel triumphant about her fate, just sad that she'd let a small amount of power turn her into someone who hurt her neighbors for profit. My phone buzzed. Text from Brett. Board meeting tonight. Want to observe. New members are suggesting stricter parking enforcement. Could use your input. I texted back. Be there at 7. I'd learned that reform wasn't a one-time event but an ongoing process. Vigilance was necessary to prevent backsliding, to ensure the lessons learned weren't forgotten. I could contribute by staying engaged, by showing up, by being a voice for fairness. At the meeting, I sat in the back and listened. The new board members, elected in the most recent HOA election, were proposing stricter parking rules for overnight guests. They claimed too many homes had multiple vehicles parking on the street. When they opened for comments, I raised my hand. Before implementing new restrictions, have you documented the actual problem? How many homes are affected? How often does it occur? Are there safety or access issues, or is this aesthetic? The new members looked at each other. They hadn't done that analysis. I'd suggest collecting data for 3 months, I continued. See if there's really a problem worth addressing. Sometimes rules create more issues than they solve. Brett nodded. Good suggestion. Let's table this pending further investigation. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Evidence-based decisions rather than reactive regulations. It was how HOAs should operate. Afterward, a new board member approached me. You're the judge who sued the HOA, right? I am. I moved here after all that happened, but I heard the stories. What you did, standing up to them, it changed this place. I ran for the board because I wanted to be part of keeping it fair. That's exactly why boards need good people. Thank you for serving. Walking home, I felt that sense of hope again. The work was ongoing, but people were engaged. The community had learned that they could hold their leaders accountable. And leaders had learned they served at the pleasure of residents, not the other way around. The next morning, I was back in my courtroom for a full docket. Divorce cases, contract disputes, small claims. The work I'd trained for, the application of law to resolve conflicts and seek justice. During a break, I looked out my window at the county courthouse grounds. People coming and going, each carrying their own problems and seeking solutions. The legal system wasn't perfect, but it provided structure for resolving disputes peacefully. That's all I'd wanted from my HOA. Not perfection, but fairness. Not absolute freedom, but reasonable rules reasonably enforced. The basics of living together in community. As years passed, Meadowbrook Estates became something of a model. Other HOAs studied our reforms. Residents from other neighborhoods reached out for advice on fighting their own battles against overreaching boards. The ripple effects continued. I eventually retired from the bench after 20 years of service. My last case, by coincidence, involved an HOA dispute. Different neighborhood, same issues. Selective enforcement, financial opacity, board members abusing authority. I ruled for the residents, issued a detailed opinion citing the need for HOA accountability, and gavelled my last session with satisfaction. In retirement, I stayed involved in HOA reform work, I testified before legislative committees, advised residents on their rights, and wrote op-eds about community governance. The fight continued, but progress was real. One afternoon, I was shoveling my driveway after a surprise spring snowstorm. It was 3 in the afternoon, broad daylight, completely legal by any standard. A car pulled up and I tensed reflexively before recognizing the response as outdated. The driver rolled down her window. "Excuse me, are you Judge Harrison? Retired, but yes. I'm moving to the neighborhood next month. I wanted to meet you. Your fight against the HOA is legendary." I laughed. "I just wanted to shovel my driveway at night." "You did more than that. You showed people they don't have to accept abuse just because it comes with official letterhead." That's the lesson, I suppose. Authority isn't self-justifying. It has to be earned and exercised responsibly. She thanked me and drove off. I finished shoveling and went inside, tracking snow across the floor again, still finding satisfaction in that small act of domestic maintenance. My house was paid off now, truly mine without any mortgage or lien. The HOA still existed, still collected dues, still enforced rules. But fairly, transparently, with accountability. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sunset. Kids played in the street. Neighbors chatted over fences. Someone barbecued despite it being barely 50 degrees. Normal life in a normal neighborhood. It had taken a fight to achieve this normalcy, but that was often how progress worked. Someone had to push back against the small injustices before they became large ones. Someone had to say no to petty tyrants before they became big ones. I'd been that someone, not because I sought conflict, but because I refused to accept unfairness. The system had worked eventually, though not without considerable effort. Justice required vigilance and courage. As darkness fell and I went inside, I passed my dining room table where old legal files still sat in boxes. The documentation of my battle with the HOA, the evidence of corruption and abuse, the proof that resistance mattered. I should probably shred those files or put them in storage. But I kept them as a reminder that ordinary people facing ordinary injustices could fight back and win. Not easily, not quickly, but ultimately. The snow melted overnight as spring snow does. By morning, my driveway was clear and wet, ready for whatever came next. Just like me, just like Meadowbrook Estates, just like all the residents who'd learned they had power they didn't know they possessed. The story ended where it began, with a driveway and a shovel and a man who just wanted to maintain his property in peace. Everything that happened in between, all the conflict and reform and change, flowed from that simple desire for fairness. Sometimes the most important battles are the smallest ones, fought not for grand principles but for the basic dignity of being left alone to live your life. That's what I'd fought for, and that's what I'd won. In the end, the HOA still stood, still functioned, still served the community. But better, fairer, more accountable. Not because they wanted to change, but because they'd been forced to by someone who refused to accept that rules mattered more than justice. That was enough. That was everything.